Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miche Thompson, and I am a lecturer and also the undergraduate convener of linguistics. That means that I teach on the course, but I'm also responsible for overseeing and moderating all of the undergraduate courses. So today I'll be talking to you a little bit about what linguistics is and how our undergraduate program is run, and then also possible careers that you could go into with a major in linguistics. So we are part of the Department of African Studies and Linguistics, but we are two separate programs. That means that you could either major in linguistics on its own or in African Studies on its own. So I am part of the Department of African Studies and Linguistics, or ASL as we call ourselves, but I'll only be talking about linguistics because unfortunately someone from African Studies couldn't attend today. All right, so what is linguistics and why should you study linguistics? The question that I often get when I tell people that I'm a linguist or that I have a PhD in linguistics is, so how many languages do you speak? And that is such a common misconception because linguistics is not about how many languages you can speak. In fact, it is the scientific and social scientific study of language. And that means that although I can't speak all 6,000 languages in the world, we could analyze them as linguists. So here we ask questions like, what are factors that are common to all languages? How can we describe these languages? How can we analyze these languages? And what are the social significance of language use? So it's not about how many languages you can speak, but about describing, analyzing, and engaging with all factors that fall into language. So why do we use language? What is language? One might think that language is about communicating, about talking to someone, just, one person sharing a message and another receiving the message, and there is shared meaning. But language is more than just talking from one person to another or communicating in a group. There are various forms of linguistic communication, and that is to say, one can use language in different ways and for different reasons. This means that language can be representational, you're using language to represent something. Language can be cognitive, that means you are using language to make sense of your thoughts, for example. Language can be emotive, conveying emotion, expressing sympathy or empathy, for example. Language can also be performative, which means that you use language to perform something. So when I say, for example, I now pronounce you husband and wife, that is me performing an act through language. Language can also be persuasive, and that means we can use language to convey a meaning or an idea that we want other people to accept, or we want them to do something. And then language is also social, and language is metalinguistic. That means we can think about language beyond language. So as you can already see, it is more than just one person talking to another or about speaking multiple languages. There's so much more to language. There's so much more to analyze and to describe and to explore when it comes to language. So now I want to bring to your attention some general questions that we have about language. And as I go through these questions, I want you to also know that all these questions that I'm listing are questions, or some of the questions, that we answer in our undergraduate program. So from first year all through third year, which is the senior course, we answer these general questions about language. And after this slide, I will also talk through the undergraduate program with you, taking you from first year all the way to third year. So what are these general questions that we have about language? Firstly, we can ask ourselves, what are the functions of human language? So why do we use language? Do we use language only to communicate? What about conveying meaning, expressing emotion, and all of these factors that I just mentioned in the previous slide? There are various functions to human language. We ask the question, what does it mean to know a language? Is it just about knowing words and throwing them together and then communicating them? What about knowing sound systems of a language, or knowing how to use language in a given context, knowing how to use language appropriately, knowing how to form words, how words are compounded, what is the correct way or the common way of combining sentences. And here we're not only talking about English or Afrikaans or African languages, we can apply this to all languages. So in our program, we analyze Japanese, Korean, Spanish, Italian, Swedish, and African languages, of course. The third question is, how is language used or misused in various contexts? So here we ask questions like, what kinds of varieties do you use in different contexts? Is there a way that you would speak to your family versus how you would speak to your social friends, your groups, your cousins, for example? Is there a specific way that you would speak in your spaces of worship versus education? There are various ways that we use language, and language is suited to specific contexts. So knowing how to use language, or that pragmatic competence about language, is also very important. And we discuss this and problematize this in our courses. And then the fourth question is, how is language structured? So English or Afrikaans or African language speakers might know how their languages are compounded or constructed and how they are formed grammatically. But we can also look at how other languages are structured. We look at ancient languages, we look at endangered languages, and as I said earlier, we look at Japanese, Spanish, Italian. So it's not about speaking the languages, but being able to study them and describe them and talk about how they are structured and how they are patterned. And then we look at how language is represented in the mind, and this takes a very psychological approach to language, and this is one of the courses that I teach, which is called Psycholinguistics. We look at what happens in the mind of a speaker when they are producing language, when they are producing and when they are comprehending language. So what are the mental representations of language? Then we ask how language has changed or how language has evolved, because language does change. It is like a living organism. And how can we describe these changes? For those of you who are Gen Z and might be on social media or TikTok, you will see that there are a lot of new words and phrases that people are using in very different contexts to mean very different things. And as it stands, we can actually see language change happening. We can see how different words, different ways of speaking have taken on a life force of its own. And we are now seeing how the English language, for example, is changing, is evolving with the use of social media. And we do actually take a look at the linguistics of social media in second year, but I'll get to that in a moment. And then another very interesting question is, how do children acquire language? And we know that babies aren't actually taught a language. We don't tell them you need to produce your sentences with a subject, a verb, and an object. There's something internal that allows babies or children or toddlers to just acquire language and somehow become proficient. And in our course, we ask, what makes language acquisition possible? What are the mental capacities or the inherent biological structures that allow people or children to acquire language? And how do we learn second languages as adults, for example? And why is it so difficult for someone who already has a language to learn an additional language? And when we answer this, we again take a very psychological approach to this. And we also delve into areas of psychology. We look at the work of Skinner and Piaget and a little bit of Noam Chomsky, who is a linguist, very formal linguist. So there's a lot of interdisciplinarity between linguistics and other social science courses, which I'll also talk about later on. And then one of the other questions we ask, and I think we address this in third year, is whether or not animals can learn languages. And here we do play a few videos about gorillas or dogs who actually communicate using English, using human language. But we then have to tackle this question from the perspective of what does it actually mean to know a language? Does the fact that the animal can sign mean that they know the phonetics, the functions, the pragmatic knowledge that I spoke about earlier on? So we talk about whether animals can learn a language and whether or not that conforms to what we think of as a language, and relating it back to what does it mean to know a language. Okay, so now we'll be talking about our undergraduate courses, starting with first year. So in first year, we have 2 semester courses. The first is a first semester course, and that is Foundations of Language. In Foundations of Language, which is a full first semester course, we explore the concepts in linguistic theory. It's basically the nuts and bolts of language. Here we look at what does it mean to know a language. So when we talk about this, we discuss phonetics and phonology. That is the sound systems of a language, looking at articulation and also sound patterns in different languages. And this is where we discuss Japanese language patterns and Korean language patterns and Italian and Spanish and Swedish language patterns. So how are the sound systems of language governed, and how can we describe them, analyze them, and portray them? Then we also look at morphology, which is how words are formed in different languages, and then syntax, which has to do with grammar and how sentences are formed, and then semantics, which is about meaning in a language, and psycholinguistics, which is the bridge between language and psychology, so language and the brain, language and the mind. In the second semester course, we look at sociolinguistics, and sociolinguistics has to do with the interplay between language and society. It's a very intersectional course. So here we look at how language functions in society, what our language biases are. We look at things like accents and why we ascribe certain privilege to certain accents. Why is one accent less favored than another? What are the social implications of that? We look at multilingualism and what it means to be multilingual, and how multilingualism is dealt with in South Africa and also globally and in education. We look at globalization and language, so how we're using language on the global scale with all this integration internationally. We look at language policy, so that has to do with the policies put in place for how we use language, what languages are taught in school, which languages are made official in certain spaces. Then we look at new languages and languages that emerge within context of contact. So what happens when people who don't speak the same first languages, or they have no languages in common? What happens when they come together and they have to communicate? So we talk about functional languages, transactional languages, and here we look at pidgins and creoles. We also look at language shift, that is when people move away from their first or primary languages in favor of another, often more powerful language. And what happens when languages die, when speakers no longer speak a certain language, and also how are languages maintained. So that has a lot to do with language documentation, language preservation, and language activism. So in the first year, you kind of deal with the basics of the 2 main tenets of linguistics. The one is formal, foundations of language, the formal aspects, the nuts and bolts of language. And in the second semester, sociolinguistics. So given those nuts and bolts, how do we use them socially? What significance does it have socially? How are we managing multilingualism? Why are we such a multilingual country, and yet English Afrikaans still has power and prestige? So we do question use of language and the social significance of language. So that's first year. In the second year course, we actually have 1 semester split into 2 terms and 2 courses. So in the first semester, Understanding Language, Meaning and Structure A, we look at language in South Africa, and we look at dialectal varieties, regional varieties, so how different people use language differently in South Africa. We look at ethnography, which is an anthropological course looking at how we can study language. How do we write about language? Who writes about us as Africans? And from whose perspective should Africa be written about? And then we have language, gender, and sexualities, which looks at the gendered way of using language, or how gender is imposed in language, and the different ways of using language given gender and sexualities. So that's the first semester. In the second semester, we look at meaning and structure B, and here we look at social media linguistics. And here we focus on the patterns of using language in social media. Are there specific ways that we use emojis, for example? Can we think about syntactically describing how emojis and sentences in social media are patterned? Are there patterned ways and structured ways of using all these affordances of social media? We look at memes, for example, and the social significance of memes. We think that memes are just something people share. It's quite funny, you relate to it, but there is linguistic and social significance to the sharing of memes, and it often tackles very socially pertinent issues. So we kind of unpack everything that has to do with communication within social media. And then we have language and the mind, and this is a course that focuses on first language acquisition in children, looking at the different theories and hypotheses for how children learn a language, looking at what mental, inherent, innate capacities children have for learning a language, and how do children develop their language between the ages of 0 to 5 years old. How is language built up in their mind as they acquire a first language? We'll also look at language deficits, so comprehension and production deficits. What happens when certain parts of the brain are injured, and how does that represent linguistically? So in which areas would you have problems with speech articulation or speech perception, depending on which area of the brain you might have had trauma to? So that's quite interesting. We look at brain imaging, and it takes a sort of neurobiological approach to language. Then finally, our third year course, again, this is split into 2 courses. In first semester, we have second language acquisition, and that is a course that I teach, which is also quite psycholinguistic. We look at why certain people can acquire a second language, one additional language, past the age of puberty, and what the issues are theoretically and hypothetically that come with trying to learn a second language when you already have languages that you know. So there's theories about competition between your mental systems, what it means to learn an additional language and its grammar and its rules. Because remember, in first year, we look at what does it mean to know a language. So in third year, you kind of tie it all together and ask the question, so what does it mean to know a language, and how is it that people learn a language when they've already passed first language acquisition? And then we have historical social linguistics, and this is a very comparative sort of historical approach to language, looking at how language has changed. You look at digital archives, making comparisons between how languages have changed over the course of centuries. And then in second semester, theoretical and applied perspectives B, we look at linguistic landscapes, and this is a very interesting course, which looks at the materiality, the physical aspects of language. And with linguistic landscapes, we study signs, we study tattoos on people's bodies, for example. We call those corporeal landscapes or skinscapes. We look at signs in society, protest signs, for example, signs in neighborhoods. Why does one neighborhood have signs where English is listed first, for example? Why in a multilingual country do we have most of our signs in English? So there's a lot of material aspects of language, and with linguistic landscapes, we study basically the material landscape of language from a social perspective. And then in the final senior course, Theories of Language, We look at, again, can animals learn language? What is language even? Is it something that is rule governed, or is it just patterns of behavior? So here you ask the sort of philosophical questions about language. All right, so that is our undergraduate program. And then, of course, I'm sure all of you want to know, so what can I do with a career in linguistics? I'm sure it's very exciting, but how can I use it? So linguistics is quite interdisciplinary. As I've talked through the courses, you will have found a lot of other disciplines sort of pop up. So we have psychology, we have anthropology, there are issues of gender, issues of society and sociology and education, because we talk about language and education. So linguistics goes very well with other cognate disciplines. But linguistics on its own, I'm going to talk about other areas of use, academia and research. So of course, if you want to do then postgraduate studies and you want to do research about language, you could do that. You could go into the university space or tertiary education space and become an academic and teach linguistics or research linguistics. Then we have learning design, which is where you design learning materials. I think you work together in a team. There are various companies at the moment that are doing learning design, and a lot of linguists go into learning design, very lucrative. Then we have language documentation, and that is where you basically document languages as they are at the moment, because a few years from now, a few decades from now, we will look back and study language evolution and study language change. So if you are very fascinated and interested and passionate about certain languages, you would go into documenting that language. And in the African Studies and Linguistics department, we actually have San and Khoi Center. And in the center, we are working towards the revitalization and the preservation of Khoi and San languages. Okay, so we're doing preservation and documentation because a lot of Khoi and San speakers, it's diminishing, but we want to preserve that language because it is so indigenous and beautiful and important to our history as South Africans. Then we have language policy and planning, and this also falls in to an extent to language documentation. But with language policy and planning, you are part of a team that helps determine how language should be used in South Africa in various spaces. So language of administration, the language policy of universities, how will languages be taught? How will classes be taught? What is the medium of instruction in different institutions? So when you do language policy and planning, you are working towards putting a policy in place for how languages should be used in different contexts and in different spaces. And then there is copy editing and publishing. I have a few students who are now working at Grammarly, I think, and in online digital editing and publishing, copyright as well. And then we have advertising, of course, because with linguistics, we look at what are people saying? What does it mean when they say certain things? How can we analyze language? How can we use language for persuasion? And with advertising, linguists are very important there because we can sort of subtly persuade people through language. And then media, of course, especially social media at this point, but various other medias like radio and journalism. I wanted to be a journalist when I first went to university, but then linguistics caught my attention and I fell in love, which is what a lot of you will experience. So journalism is one of them. And then television and film, you will see that I have Tyrion Lannister on one of these as a picture here. Because with television and film, because you know how language works by the end of your undergraduate career, you will know how to come up with languages. So languages like Dothraki or Klingon or all these other fictional languages will then have their own rules and patterns and structures. So as a linguist, you will be able to develop a language for media and television and entertainment and film. And then, of course, linguistics is relevant in education and language teaching, teaching English as a first language, teaching English as a second language or as a foreign language. And we know there are a lot of companies and agencies currently recruiting for teaching English as a second language. Okay, I'm going to end my presentation here because I haven't had a chance to look at the question and answer section. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to answer any questions that you might have in the Q&A session. Thank you so much. Okay, so the first question is, although it is not required to know multiple languages, are any languages included or taken within the curriculum or possibly as electives instead? So within the faculty and within humanities, we do have a lot of languages. We have a School of Languages and Literature section. So if you want to, you could definitely take an additional language and study that language or major in that language or take it as an elective. It would definitely help. It will be interesting because you'll be studying linguistics, but also seeing how the language works when you're taking that language as an elective. So if you're taking Spanish or initial French, for example, you would be able to make more sense of that language because you have all of this linguistic knowledge. Okay. And then someone asked, what is the African Studies side of the course? So in the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the fact that we are the Department of African Studies and Linguistics, and unfortunately, we don't have a lecturer from African Studies present today. But African Studies is also very interdisciplinary program which looks at representations of Africa and governance in Africa. How is Africa presented? How is Africa written about? So it's kind of political, talks about gender in Africa, language in Africa. So it all goes together. So if you decide to take some electives, you could take some electives in African studies and see how they combine with linguistics. But African studies is very interesting. And like I said, we have the Khoi and San unit, which looks at historical and indigenous archives of the Khoi and San people. And then someone asked, do you do neurolinguistics at any stage? Yes. So the neurolinguistics section comes in with the second year and third year course, language and the mind and psycholinguistics. And when we do the course on second language acquisition and first language acquisition, we actually do touch on neurolinguistics, so how language is represented in the mind. We look at certain parts of the brain, what happens when there's damage to certain parts of the brain, and how does that present linguistically. Okay, there are no other questions at the moment, so I'll just sit and wait. Okay, so thank you everyone for your attendance and for your questions. If you have any further questions, just have a look at our website. And I hope to see you next year. Thanks so much.